Hey, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Facts on the Ground. My name is Misty Winston, and I am joined by my co-host Jesse Zerowell. Today, I'm very excited. We have a super interesting guest. He is a rapper, an activist, an organizer, been on the ground since he was a teenager, is involved in a lot of really interesting projects. So today, I am very excited to welcome our guest, AWKWORD. Thank you so much for joining us on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, of course. So you actually have a pretty interesting story as far as how you got involved in activism. Can you tell us a little bit about that, like growing up with your mom and everything? I love people's origin stories.
Yeah, sure. I was definitely raised by a woman who cared more about everyone than she did about herself. She, before I was born, was a women's rights activist, an anti-war activist, a civil rights activist. And then in her later years, before she died of cancer, like throughout my childhood, she was really focused on saving the planet. She started the Earth Day in the town I grew up in, started the youth environmentalist group. And she just,
Unknown caller.
that's about right. Let me turn that off. She just, raised me to be like that. And the one thing that really differentiated her and me is that she was also like a really peaceful, calm, optimistic person. She always told me to look on the bright side. I was born angry, I think, but what I saw around me made me a lot angrier. I experienced a lot of anti-Semitism growing up, and then witnessing the way these same people treated people of color, LGBTQ people, people with disabilities, people who were shorter, just like the way that people treat other people was what really first, along with being raised by an activist mom, of course, was what really radicalized me. Just, wanting justice, wanting equality. And then as I got older and learned more and more, all the ways that these, microaggressions and mini oppressions that I saw on a daily basis were also systemic. That's how I really, transformed from someone who, went around just trying to beat up as many Nazis as I could, just to someone who was organizing to make, real substantive change.
Was there keeping with the origin theme for a moment, was there a catalyzing moment for you when a switch sort of flipped? And
honestly, it's funny. No one's ever asked me, which is weird because I do interviews and that's a pretty standard almost question. Did something specific set me off or, not necessarily. I grew up, obviously I'm most well known now for criminal and racial and social justice work. And, being an abolitionist, my really early on, I was involved with running away from cops, whether it was for graffiti or for fighting or something else. I've never had a good relationship with police. But in terms of becoming an organizer or an activist, I think, again, it goes back to just what I experienced. And witnessing what others were experiencing. One thing really stands out to me from a personal perspective is a girl spit on me and called me a kike. And, she was a girl. And I try really hard not to be sexist to the point of measuring chivalry is also sexist. And there's just a million ways to be sexist. I guess I would think the same if it was a really tiny guy who spit on me. I might not do anything, but my standard response to that would have been violence, and there was nothing I could do. I went home and I told my mom about it, and next thing I knew, I was creating with the Anti-Defamation League, which now I know is, an imperfect organization like most, but creating a diversity day, which I also now know that concept is imperfect. But the purpose was to give a voice to all of these kids in my school who didn't have a voice because of the white Christian conservatives who were brutalizing people. So that was like the first thing I did on my own. And it was, I guess, partly personal, partly what I was seeing in the world, and partly my mom's inspiration.
Yeah. So, and you just mentioned that you're an abolitionist, and I think that, especially recently, that word's been used a lot more. Defund has been used a lot more. There seems to be a lot of fear mongering and confusion over what these two words mean. So, can you maybe just tell us, what does defund mean to you, and how does that help us achieve full abolition?
Yeah. It is funny that even defund is, like Obama even, well, not even, Obama said that that's a problematic term. Clyburn said the same thing. I guess I bring these people up like because they're Black. I can't imagine being a Black person, how not problematic that would be to me, because it's as someone who has white skin, I find it very much not problematic. And I don't think it's even up for debate as to what the meaning is. Defund is not even sufficient, which is why I'm not calling to defund the police. Defund means take money out of police departments. And, in New York City, they were able to defund the police last year by moving $1 billion from out of the police budget through literally moving school cops from the police budget to the education budget. So the cops didn't go away. The militarization of schools and the school to prison pipeline continued. They just switched the budget around. That counted. There are obviously better examples where, a fair amount of money was taken out, but you can't just defund. Defunding for me is step one on the road to full abolition. And we need to, over time, defund to zero. That means defunding police salaries to zero. That means defunding police departments to zero. And there are a ton of things that can happen right away as we're defunding that are essential to making this work and leading us to an abolitionist, humanist society. There are really concrete examples that are criminal justice specific changes, like ending cash bail, ending solitary confinement, ending the death penalty, ending qualified immunity, and then there are, ending contracts, private, public contracts for surveillance, ending, all of the ways that children are specific classes or communities of children are criminalized in our schools, ending the militarized equipment giveaways from the federal government. All of these things can happen pretty much right now. Whereas abolition, if we were to literally dismantle every single police department and close every single jail and prison, we would be in trouble because our society is not prepared for that. So, what we need to be doing during the time that we're defunding on the road to abolition is developing these alternative mechanisms that would create a different justice system, a true justice system based on, reparative, transformative justice. Meanwhile, developing, all of these life-affirming institutions in place of incarceration, surveillance, and everything else that is used to criminalize, control, and put away certain people. So that could include jobs training, that could include free substance abuse treatment, mediation, wellness checks instead of patrols. These are all things that we would need to put in place for the time that we get where we're ready to replace prison, cops in cages. We actually have this stuff built up where it will work. But to those who say that any of these concepts are too radical, I always point, before I even get into that, what I just said, what we're doing now isn't isn't working. I mean,
No.
on one hand, like it's working exactly as it was intended, because, you know, cops came to be after slavery, and prisons after slavery were turned into, you know, the new places to enslave the former slaves. So in that way, it's working perfectly. But if you're interested in like equality and justice for all people, it's not working at all. So, you know, and so there are some really obvious examples. You know, people of color are obviously the predominance of those in prison. 1 in 3 Black boys born today will wind up incarcerated. Black people are 600% more likely to be killed by a cop. Indigenous people are more likely to be killed by a cop than that. You know, 7 out of 10 people in jails have not been convicted of a crime. I mean, I can go on and on. Cops are responsible for 1/3 of all stranger murders in this country. And, you know, studies show that interactions with police increase the likelihood of future criminality. If you take that and add on to the fact that cops only solve 2% of all major crimes, what is their purpose to begin with? What is prison's purpose to begin with? It was initially designed for penitence, but there's no rehabilitation whatsoever. So the people who do come out are more likely to go back in than not. So we have to have something that is alternative to what's happening today, because it's a failure for, you know, to the people.
Yes, absolutely. And I actually want to touch quickly on I appreciate your approach, because you aren't starting at, you know, the minimum. You're not saying defund, you're saying abolish, but we can work towards that through defunding, because I think all too often, especially on the left, we are too willing to compromise, and we'll go into a debate like with our bottom number rather than, you know, this is what we want. You can kind of maybe meet us in the middle. And so just from my personal perspective, I appreciate that approach that you're saying full out, I'm an abolitionist. Let's do this thing. Because I think that often is something that the left lacks. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I mean,
So,
there's a lot that we lack, because we're all imperfect, you know,
yeah.
but, you know, it's interesting. Like, I don't know if the people who were arguing with me last night would be considered a part of the left. They're more like liberals, but they're telling me what you just said, that like, that's too radical. Like, that's crazy. We need to say reform. And I'm like, no, I'm specifically not saying reform, because reform only strengthens the institution. Prison itself was a reform from what preceded that, and the ankle monitors and the, you know, people being stuck in their own homes and all of that stuff. It's all incarceration. It's just like the reforms make it seem like it's better, except it's not. It's actually just widening the grip that this type of control has on society. And when we were creating the group 10 demands and our 10 demands for justice, that's one of the things that I said was, we have to, you know, be radical. You know, if we ask for the bare minimum, we're going to get less than that. If we demand abolition and actually do the work for them and tell them how we can get there, we may not get abolition. Ideally we would, but if we don't get it overnight, like, and eventually get it, great. There's so much that can be done now, and we aim really high, and then they're going to be like, all right, well, we can't give you that. We'll give you this. And I liken it to the example of MLK, and Malcolm X, because without Malcolm X, without the Black Panther Party, the civil rights wins that everyone attributes to Martin Luther King wouldn't have happened. You know, the power holders were terrified of the non-peaceful versions. They were terrified of Black people with guns. And so they took the lesser of two evils in their minds. They hated them all, believe me, but they were like, well, if we don't do what MLK's asking, we're gonna have to face something a lot scarier.
Yeah, it was a little bit of good cop, bad cop. That was I think that's really interesting. But you're right. We can't go into a negotiation and ask for the bare minimum. That's not how negotiations work.
Right.
So you did mention the 10 demands for justice, and I do want to get into that because I think it's a really important organization that is really well thought out. So before we get into the actual 10 demands, because I think it's important to know exactly what those are, can you talk to us a little bit about how this came about? What organizations did you work with? What leaders from the Black community did you speak with to kind of figure out what the best things were to ask for, just kind of how that process worked out?
Yeah, sure. This is something that I, as an individual, have been working on for, nearly 2 decades. It's long been my focus. But in various ways I've been involved, whether it's, going to maximum security prisons and, exchanging ideas with incarcerated people, or lobbying Congress for a repeal of the Rockefeller drug laws in New York. I, like everyone, I think, well, I had a lot of people tell me after George Floyd was murdered and there were these protests, like a lot of people, it like opened a lot of people's eyes. And, more than one person said to me, people who know me well, not like, random person on Twitter, family members, man, you've been saying this for a long time. Like, you've been saying Black Lives Matter for a long time. I get it now, and so I wasn't at all surprised what happened to George Floyd. The same thing happened to Eric Garner, but it was a shock to the rest of the country. I mean, as a whole in general. And there was sustained protest day after day after day. And in some cities, they haven't even stopped. The greatest, biggest leftist, or any, I should say, probably uprising in this country's history. The fact that there were protests in every single state for months. This was bigger than the civil rights movement in terms of just, not necessarily in its impact, but in terms of like the amount of involvement and how overwhelming it was, like in controlling the conversation, bigger than the Vietnam, anti-Vietnam era, everything. So a lot of people were talking about like, what can we do beyond just protesting? And so along with, initially about like 10 or so other activists who I mainly knew, other than Pepper Oceana, who I worked with to sue New York State to put Bernie back on the ballot. I really hadn't worked outside of like the internet with most of these people, but we all knew each other from tweeting. And, we decided to get together to do more than that, because as good as protest is to, especially the types of protests we saw with the anti-fascist involvement, protests are good to strike fear. And, I consider protest one part of a multi-pronged approach. And another significant part is actually putting pressure on our elected officials. And you can only get so far with peaceful protest. And as we see, if you're a person of color or you're on the left, it doesn't matter how peaceful you are, you're going to get beaten, tear gas, kidnapped, arrested, whatever. So again, like, we're just trying not to die on the streets. And, having a banner that says Black Lives Matter or something more unique and creative, like, it's good for photo ops, it's good to scare people to some degree, but without demands, without specific concrete proposals and solutions, you're not going to get as far. So this kind of was developed, again, after George Floyd. The group kind of formed organically, and the demands were developed to serve as kind of a support for the people on the streets. So one of the early things we did was distribute our flyers, which actually listed the demands themselves to protests in cities across the country. what we're working on now is a more direct approach to holding our elected officials accountable, which is, and in between, we've been doing a lot of education. That's been our main focus, expanding people's understanding of abolition, and getting more people to jump on board with this. Now we have an open letter where we're using ResistBot, where people can just use their phones to text and send a letter that we created, carefully worded, a subject line that does not have the word defund or abolition in it. You send an email to your mayor, your governor, state Congress, federal Congress, and inside it outlines exactly what we're demanding and why. It sets up what our society is like today. And, if you, as you, the mayor, or you, the senator, or whatever, you realize that you can be a part of history by not being a sellout, by not being afraid, by bringing this to your peers, and by championing it, you will be a hero. If you do nothing, we won't vote for you at all. In terms of who we reached out to, you can go to 10forjustice.com, and you can see there's a huge list of alliances. And so a lot of those people are people that we spoke with before we released the demands, as we were developing them. In some cases after the fact, we are totally open and to, where we don't know everything, especially I, as the kind of like, I don't know if unfortunate's the word, but as this like face of the organization and figurehead, it's because I'm accustomed to doing interviews as a musician, and as an activist, but there are Black women, Indigenous women, immigrants, who were just as involved, if not, who are more, even more instrumental in developing, what we needed to say, because they live it, and just don't want to be a face, don't want to be doing interviews and are afraid and all of that stuff. So having said all of that, like we coordinated all of us with our different communities. So I know a lot of, big name activists. I know a lot of people who work in abolition and in criminal justice, in, people, formerly incarcerated people, while Cheyenne, for example, knew a ton of people in the Indigenous community. Patrona reached out to some of her Black friends, as did Nick, who goes by Socialist MMA.
Love Nick.
Yeah, Nick's great, man. And I'll give you an update on what's coming next with Nick and me and Patrona. So I wouldn't say it was formal. And that's why I was going to say, like, we've made changes already since the initial version, and we're open to making more, which is where I went with the, like, I'm not the best figurehead, but I just am. We don't know everything, you know what I'm saying? And so, like, we've learned from Angela Davis, we've learned from Mariam Kaba, we've learned from Dereka Purnell, and like I've spoken with a few of them myself, with Dereka, for instance, and with Maya Chenoir, and who runs Truth Out and wrote Prison by Any Other Name. I've spoken with a lot of people to like get us to where we are, and we have a ton of resources on the site, on the resources tab, that expand upon why our demands contain what they do. People who have been doing this longer, who know it better. When people ask stupid questions or smart ones, I say, go to 10 for Justice to learn what our demands are. And then if you want to really learn what abolition is, read these books, download these toolkits, that Critical Resistance put together or Angela Davis wrote. Don't just trust me. You know what I'm saying? And to help with the education, in conclusion of all this, Nick and I, along with Patrona, are going to we're recording for the first time this coming weekend. We're going to do a separate video for each of the demands. And then at the end of the video, we'll say, here's your opportunity to take action, sign this letter, send it to your, text your letter to your elected officials. And video is the most effective tool, form of media. And I think getting me, Nick, and Petrona on together to explain how we came up with the demand, why the demand is needed, and breaking down all the different elements. So like, this is what this law is that we want to get rid of. This is what this law is that we want to pass. Will really help people even further than like what we can do just me doing interviews like this or like tweeting when something terrible happens.
Mm-hmm. And I wanted to ask you too about there's obviously the police and the so-called criminal justice system, but I think there's an academia component of that as well. I majored in criminal justice as an undergrad, and early last year I did an interview with Alex Vitale, who wrote The End of Policing. Yeah. And he jokingly, but I think somewhat seriously as well, referred to criminal justice programs in American universities, at least, as cop shops. They don't question the structure of the criminal justice system so much as accept it for what it is and teach you about it and prepare you to enter it in some way, whether it's as a cop or a lawyer. So I'm curious as to your perspective on how important it is to structurally change that, the academia component.
Yeah, interesting. I love Alex, and I trust his take. But like, it's interesting to hear you say it though, because and I went to a pretty leftist school, and I didn't go to like John Jay or the College of New Jersey and study criminology, which would lead me to be a criminologist or a lawyer or God forbid a cop. I studied sociology at Vassar, and like I learned how fucked up this shit is, and like how it doesn't have to be this way, how it was created by white men, by white Christian men, and like how it can be undone by everybody else. So yeah, I mean, it's like, I think it doesn't help, right? Like clearly every time someone is educated in the wrong way with misleading information, or as you put it, like with the assumption that it just is what it is, like that's a big part of this and a big part of reform, and why reform is touted by the press. But the people who know better are like, that didn't help. That was worse. Now it's worse. Now we're more ingrained than we were before. Yeah, I mean, I think all of these, angles, addressing them, changing how they're approached, can be really helpful. I think the more academics that come out of colleges as abolitionists as opposed to cops, the better. But I think that we're more likely to force change in our society and have colleges and universities be forced to adapt. Because if the colleges and universities can say, this is what it is, I have to teach this, no one's going to argue with that. Like, we have to change what it is. So they have to teach what it is, right? Like, right now you could probably take a class on these foolish abolitionists, but like, you have to have all the theory behind it. And then after that, you have to have all this stuff about like why it is, like what it is. Right. But to me, I think a lot depends on like the political leanings of the institution, on the one hand, and on the other, like if you hear that we are 5% of the world's population, but 25% of the world's incarcerated population. If you hear that cops kill 3 people a day, I just don't know how what it is doesn't automatically inspire you to question if there's an alternative that would be better.
Yeah. Well, it seemed like a lot of the professors I had, minus a few who were very good, came out of the same sort of system themselves. So it's almost like a pyramid scheme in a way. They go through the system and then they become teachers in the system, and you go through the system and then you end up somehow in the system as well.
I think it really just speaks to how structurally everything, I mean, because I see the same thing. I'm a free speech activist, and I see the same thing in journalism schools. It's, you are churned out to be a propagandist for the state. That's what they teach you. And so I think it really is, like Awkward was saying, you almost have to force the change and then make them catch up with you, because, trying to address, the educational system and all of those, academia related, that's, to me, that seems like, putting the cart before the horse. You know what I mean? Like, I feel like we have to force the change in our communities first. But I mean, that's just me. That's actually, Jesse, that was a really good question because I hadn't thought of that.
Yeah.
I was like, so now I'm going to have to go sit and think about this for a while after we're done, because that was a really good question. I'm really proud of my co-host.
I don't know enough about that system of the churn that you're talking about.
Yeah. And,
one final thing to add is, we have more control over state schools, right? So private institutions, if their mission is, to fight everything that Awkward says, we're not changing that. But if taxpayer money is going into the state schools or something, I think we can say you can't do this anymore. It's never crossed my mind as an avenue to take to influence that. But it certainly wouldn't hurt. And I think we could be effective when it comes to things we can control.
Yeah. And what prompted me to ask that is this great clip of Fred Hampton speaking with, I believe, organizers who were outside of the Black Panthers, and he was listening to them. They presented their points, and he came back and said, well, there's nothing in there about education for our communities. How are we going to achieve X, Y, and Z if the people aren't educated? If you're keeping the people purposely,
I know
keeping the people
exactly
ignorant
the clip you're talking
by
about.
omission. Yeah, and I think that's still such a relevant discussion.
Yeah, without a doubt. But I do see that as separately, although I'm not familiar with the clip. So, but I suspect he was talking about children, primary education. And, that's a big component of the 10 demands, even demilitarizing schools and ending the school to prison pipeline. And something I talk about a lot as an individual as well, changing what we're teaching. I actually had a song years ago called Imperialism, where I just talked about my verse was about how when I went to school, we spent the entire quarter and 99% of every chapter of every textbook on the kings and queens and the popes, and then glossed over or spent a split second on, here's what's happening in Africa, and certainly not from the African perspective. And there's a reason a lot of people who are radicalized at young ages don't want to go to school, because it's the master's bullshit. So, I absolutely think that needs to be critically changed. And the rare teacher who's teaching the truth is so valuable.
Yes, that's kind of my favorite thing about the virus. I mean, I get to teach my kids at home, so I can radicalize them here at my house and teach them what's actually going on. I mean, we do the Indigenous People's History of the United States by Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz. My kids and I have gone through that. They're only 12 and 10, so know, but yeah, that's one positive of having to homeschool, is that I can kind of teach real history, you know, at least to the best that I know it, because it's really difficult to find actual real history.
Yeah.
So, you know, you really have to
just
seek it out.
anecdotally, throughout my entire pre-college education, the only time the Black Panthers ever came up was when I decided in 8th grade to do my final research paper on them. And
I don't think I was ever taught about the Black Panthers in public schools.
And I grew up in white suburbia and
Same.
like middle class, and the fact that we know that's still happening, that there's still that absence of
Oh yeah.
you know,
Why would they want to? Yeah, why would they want to teach the kids that like Black people can have guns and actually serve their own communities, feed each other, and give each other health services? Like that goes against everything, right? Like
Yes.
yeah, that was certainly the unspoken mentality, if it wasn't spoken behind closed doors. And I think it's very frightening that so much of the population, the citizenry of this country, and I don't even like to use citizenry because that implies legality and legal and illegal, and I don't believe anybody can be illegal.
Yeah.
But it's frightening that there are so many people out there who are still being educated in the same way, and it's basically complete ignorance. And then I can see why, when they're presented even with something like defunding the police, it's like a shock to their system. It's like, this is too radical. That's some commie bullshit or whatever, you know? And so anyway, that's just getting back to like the education point. And but I think, you know, what you're doing with the 10 steps is a form of education, and it's kind of taking the education into your own hands. And that's what we need to do. One of many things we need to do.
Yep. And I appreciate you saying that, and that it definitely applies. It's a lack of education. It's, you know, the power of words and how easily they can inspire or confuse. And, you know, and we're not going to sugarcoat it, right? Like you guys said, we do mean abolish, but we also don't mean, like, abolition is about presence. It's not about absence. And we don't mean that every single person should be released from prison tomorrow. And also, what your news stations and your movies and your TV shows have taught you, that there's tons of serial killers out there, that's a lie. It's less than 1%. So we could open up the prisons and you'd be safe. You know, like when cops go on strike, crime goes down. Prisons do not deter crime, you know, so like, it's just a matter of education. And it also leads me, as an abolitionist who believes in the power of transformative, reparative justice, and of not labeling certain people criminals and deciding what their fate is, and them being like irretrievable or unreformable or whatever. That applies to the Nazis who stormed the Capitol also. You know, it's a tough place you're put in when you're an abolitionist, when a cop does something horrific or a Nazi does something horrific, because you believe that they deserve, that like they should get justice, right? Like that we should get justice for what has been done. And as long as there's no, like, as long as a black man can like steal a backpack and end up in jail, or actually be forced into confessing to stealing a backpack he didn't steal, go to jail for 2 years and spend all of it in solitary, and then come and kill himself, like, then, you know, I want the white guy who did something way worse to get the worst sentence. So that's a tough kind of dilemma. And so what I always say to that is, like, as long as we're in our current system then everyone should get equal justice. When we have moved beyond that, and in an ideal world, and as we wrote in the 10 demands, for cops who commit a crime, they should face reparative justice. They should pay back what they owe to the victim and to the society at large. So we can never, as an organization, call for a jail sentence or a prison sentence that just expands the power of prisons and jails. And when it comes to someone who wants me dead currently, I can point to the fact that there are Nazis who have turned into anti-Nazis. So instead of going on a shooting rampage or doing what I did as a kid and trying to fist fight all of them, it's ignorance. It's this lack of education you're talking about. And we need to show them why what they've been taught to believe is nonsense, and how we actually have the same enemies, and it's not each other, and it shouldn't be based on skin color. And if we can achieve that, and someone who has committed a crime as a Nazi, based on race or religion or whatever, and they can, do community service, or they can repair those relationships, and as a human being, rehabilitate and transform both their lives and the victims' lives and the lives of everyone in the community, then we've overcome this lack of education. We've overcome everything we've been taught since birth about prisons and police. And that's what, as an abolitionist, I'm hoping for, is that whether it's the case of a cop or a Nazi, we choose the right path that looks at human beings as human beings and gets to them on that level.
When you say Nazi, what is your definition of that? Just because
that word's been thrown around a lot.
Yeah,
I've been called a Nazi over the past 2 weeks.
Yeah.
I use that word intentionally, though, because if you are someone who's chanting blood and soil, if you're someone who even dabbles in conspiracy theories about Jews running the world, if you think that that Black people should be lynched, if you're a member of the Proud Boys, Patriot Prayer, or any of these organizations, I consider you a Nazi. And you're welcome to disagree with me. I know that but I'm not shy. I'm not shying away from saying that you're making a mistake platforming these people. You're making an equally big, if not bigger, mistake trusting these people. We have a hard enough time on the left trusting each other when we all mean well, and none of us hate Black people for being Black, or Jews for being Jews, or immigrants for not being Italian or Irish but being Muslim or Mexican. To just start inviting Nazis or any person on the far right, call them what you will, into our strategy meetings to form a big workers movement is insane. If you want to do what they're claiming, if you want to do what the Black Panther Party actually did, which was coordinate with anti-racist white people or push racists into becoming anti-racist and then work with them, that's great. The bigger our community is, the better, the more powerful we'll be. Like I said, I do believe that we all have the same enemy. But too much of this country, 50% of it, in my opinion, doesn't know that yet. Mm-hmm. They still see me as an enemy because of my people, because of my blood. Mm-hmm. So I'm not working with those people. Christian Smalls, who I interviewed the other day and who I asked this question, is not working with these people. Mm-hmm. We need to have good reason to believe that it's safe to do so.
Right.
I think that's fair.
I agree with that. And it also reminds me of something I wanted to ask earlier when you were talking about approaching legislators and instilling fear in them, the fear that their legacy will be tarnished. And a lot of the people, or a lot of the attitudes, a lot of the racism, a lot of the homophobia, a lot of what we've been talking about, there are a lot of people still in government who, again, maybe not outwardly, but certainly behind closed
Biden.
doors. Yeah.
Biden has been hugely detrimental to communities of color. He wrote the crime bill.
And, Kamala Harris as well.
Yeah.
So to me, it seems like a catch-22, because you want to put fear in the hearts of these people to make change. But how likely do you think they are to even be receptive to that when what we're trying to fight is so institutionalized, and beyond that, so embedded in so many Americans' heads?
Totally. I mean, I think it depends on the politician. When you have the two people, the president and vice president, being who they are, the likelihood of drastic substantive change is very small. But as we said earlier, like, we aim as high as we can. We aim for what we believe it should be, and we get something less than that. But if we didn't aim for that, we'd get nothing. So while, and my wife was like, why can't you just be happy for once? I'm like, that is not me, right? Like, I am not going to celebrate the fact that Biden wants to stop private prison contracts, because it's 8% of the prisons. But am I happy it happened? Yeah, it's better than it not happening. But I think that the only way to do it is not to just rely on them. Like you're saying, like, there's a lot of other things that we can continue to do that is part of this multi-pronged approach. But since outside of revolution and us starting over, the laws can only be changed by lawmakers, right? And so we just have to continue to educate and grow our coalition so that there is more public pressure. The more pressure there is, the more they're going to have to move. And, and the more we'll slowly pick off all the racists who've been in power for so long. And when it comes to politicians, that is, like, we need to replace them. We need to elect people who are not them. Ideally, the people who've been silenced the longest. Black women, for instance, having someone who, a Mexican immigrant, a trans person, like, those who are most affected by how screwed up everything is. They're certainly, going to, and like, yeah, I mean, incrementalism, right? Like, at the same time, like, AOC was like, oh yes, Cori Bush, like, even more so, a Ferguson activist. Like, I was so excited, but then we saw them all lay down and, like, not challenge Pelosi, not force Medicare for all. And so, like, how long is it going to be for us to slowly replace all these people to the point where, like, the squad is not a minority anymore? I mean, there are a lot of people in this country who don't have time to wait. Like, they're all going to be in prison or dead. So, like, it all has to happen at once. And as you ask me, like, as fast as fucking possible. Like, you got to replace the politicians at every single turn. But we also, like, but we need to push these demands. We need to keep protesting, and we need to dismantle every single police department as quickly as possible, because they're a white supremacist institution from the get-go. And then on top of that, for the last 20 years, they've been actively infiltrated by white supremacists. Like, it's white supremacy on white supremacy. Like, there's no one safe. So, like, that has to be replaced. I mean, it's got to come from all these different angles. Because to your point, like, what are we going to get a Joe Biden or a Kamala Harris to do?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's, people keep telling me that I should be excited because there's a woman as vice president. My little girls have somebody to look up to, and no, they don't.
Exactly.
I don't want my little girls looking up to Kamala Harris. I mean, sorry, I just don't. She's not a good person. So,
No.
I mean, representation is great. I think it does make a difference. I think having a seat at the table and having your voice be heard is a wonderful thing. But if those people are also institutionally corrupted, that doesn't really matter much. So, it is kind of.
Yeah, it's the wrong black woman, right?
Right.
Sorry. And, like, and that's why when I mentioned diversity in reference to like me starting this diversity day, diversity is great. But if the people who are part of this thing, whatever it is, whether it's a company or a business or a company or an organization or the government or the country, if the people don't feel valued, respected, and heard, if there's no inclusion, the diversity doesn't have much value. So like electing someone who is particularly horrific for people of color as a DA, because she's a black woman is performative. It looks pretty, but it's bullshit. She's like, what she has done is electing someone like that is way worse than electing, a rich white Christian white man. What I already said, white, I think, who happens to like be on the right side, who happens to care, right? Like, yeah, it's bullshit.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. If we're going to use an old white man compared to a black woman, if we had like a Bernie Sanders compared to a Kamala Harris, that's a huge difference. And yeah, he's a white guy, but that is still a huge difference. And I'm not a Bernie fan, but that's still a huge difference. So yeah, I definitely take that. Now, I don't want to make you go through all 10. We will definitely link to the website in the show notes so that everybody can go check them out. But selfishly, I have a question about, I think it's number 9, maybe, but reparations, because I, for a very long time, have wanted to interview somebody, talk to people, have a conversation about reparations. It's something I've always supported. But as a white woman, I feel very awkward. That's probably a terrible use of that word. But I do feel it's like I'm scared to like wade into that water because it's not really my place, but it is something that I support. So, I've been reading From Here to Equality, and I've been trying to, kind of wrap my head around it. But and this is like a really loaded question, but like for you, what does reparations mean? What does that look like? How does that work? Because it seems like it's such a controversial issue, even within like the African descendants of slaves movement. So that's another part of the reason why I'm so scared to do it, because I really don't want to offend anybody. I just really want to learn more and figure out how that works. So what do you think? Where do you come from on that?
I mean, you can't please everyone. I think your perspective of knowing your place, so to speak, of not, only being able to say and so much as a white woman is the right mindset to have. I just think about like another horrific case of police brutality yesterday that I shared. A black female student getting body slammed to the ground. It is my personal, well, right. And it is my personal belief that if we stop showing this stuff, we will be further from ending it. There are a number of black people who agree with me, but there are a number who don't and don't want me sharing it. So I can't please everyone. When it comes to reparations, I could be off, but I believe that the ones who may be against it are the Bill Cosby types who think that the problem is in the black home, the black family, not pulling yourself up from the bootstraps.
Yeah, like pull your pants up and get on with it.
Yeah, right. Literally, like stop sagging your pants. Yeah, like that's like, to me, that's bullshit. Like if I just try to put myself in their place. If we're only in this country because my ancestors were kidnapped from Africa, brought here, and like managed to survive the torture of slavery, and I had to start from where they had to start, I would certainly want reparations. So. And in this case, because we do talk about reparative justice, like reparations are financial for the most part. But, I would say that if you wanted to get a better understanding of the language choices, what was included, I would defer to one of the black people in my organization and one of the indigenous people in my organization, because both are included and both know better from their family members and ancestors what it needed to say. Like that demand in particular was, the hardest to write. And I probably had the least involvement in, for the very reasons you're saying it was hard to even broach the subject. But it does distinguish 10 Demands from a lot of other abolitionist groups or sets of demands and things like that, in that, we specifically say both, for all descendants of African slaves, that not only are they owed financial restitution, but what we heard from a lot of from Black leaders is that they want a public apology, which they haven't even been given. So just acknowledging that this is owed to them. And when it comes, to the indigenous people, it's slightly different. They want recognition.
Land back.
Right.
Land
Exactly.
back. I'm a huge supporter of the land back movement. Yeah.
Right. That's just the clean way of putting it. And, so sovereignty is something that, they deserve because they were here first, right? Like it's somewhat, the context is pretty different for both, but both deserve uniquely, more than any other community in this country, apologies and reparations. So that is something that we at 10 Demands thought was essential to including.
Yeah, and if you look at, to tie in U.S. foreign policy, the same argument could be made for the people of Iraq, for example, a country we're still destroying, millions of lives destroyed, displaced. And that's not just with this current iteration of the war on Iraq. You can go back to
decades.
the 1990-91 version. And I don't know how many people remember this. And I think the anniversary is coming up soon, but the Amaria air raid shelter bombing, where there were 400 plus Iraqi civilians sheltering from, what were then called Allied bombs. But obviously that's, a clean euphemism to cover up what they really are. They knew it was an air raid shelter, and they bombed it, and they incinerated everybody who was in there. And George Bush Sr. at the time, long and thankfully dead at this point. Well, not long dead. It's only been a little while, but mercifully, he refused to apologize. And he said the same thing when the U.S. shot down a civilian Iranian airliner in the 80s and killed.
Didn't he say something extremely arrogant, like the United States doesn't apologize, or something really terrible?
Yeah.
What an asshole.
And so that, what you were just saying puts me in mind of that. And
didn't Obama do the same thing? Like wrote a book about how great he was as president. Yes. Then didn't it come out that he actually said, turns out I'm really good at killing people?
Yes.
Yeah.
We're ruled by psychopaths. I say this all the time, but we legitimately are ruled by psychopaths. That's not like me being glib or hyperbolic. That's they really are psychopaths. They're not good people. They do not care about you. They don't care about me. They don't care about any of us or anybody in the entire world. It's a problem. I don't know. Power attracts those kinds of people, and I don't know how we figure out how to prevent that from happening. I think we just do away with leaders, but that's just my opinion.
I brought up the two examples I did with regard to foreign policy just because we live in a time where collective memory is so short. Oh, yeah. And I'm not saying I know more than other people, and a lot of people probably don't know what I'm talking about when I'm referring to that bombing. Actually, I think a lot of people do, the Amaria air raid shelter bombing, but we live in a time where collective memory is so short. It's just about today, the moment. If you watch the worst of the worst mainstream media dumps like Rachel Maddow or Sean Hannity or Anderson
Chris
Cooper.
Cuomo is my favorite.
Chris
turd.
Cuomo, yeah, Chris Cuomo. It's about like, the farthest they go back in time is, maybe what happened in the morning of that day that they're reporting. And so I just bring it up because I think because our collective memory is so short and, we can't even look to the past few decades of what we've done and apologize for that. It seems like a monumental task to, I think it should happen. I totally agree with you about reparations, but it just seems to me that
it's monumental.
It's monumental because it's like, well, and I hear this all the time, and it's always from people who, just don't really want to engage with the issue of abolishing police because it's too hard to think about in their minds. But they say, well, that was, so many hundreds of years ago or whatever.
Get over it.
Again, like this Bill Cosby, like pull up your pants conservatism. And I'm just wondering what you think of that because I'm on board with all the work you're doing, and I agree with pretty much all of your points, but that's sort of like the feeling I get, like the collective memory is so shortened and distorted that it's going to be hard to very hard to make
when
a
it comes
case.
to the abolition part, thankfully, and I'm being facetious, but every single day they kill someone else,
right,
or they beat the shit out of someone else. So we don't need long-term memories to know how not good they are. So
right.
like that's easy, in terms of reparations, I actually personally, you're absolutely right with like the 24-hour news cycle. There's no denying that. But in the grand scheme of things, like slavery wasn't even that long ago. And the civil rights laws were passed like 15 years before I was born. I'm still considered young. I know I look younger than I am. Like I'm almost 40 now, but like,
Same
so
here.
if you can, you also look young. So if you consider that though, like only 15 years before I was born or 17 years before I was born or something, prior to that, black people couldn't vote. Like, so this, again, not that long ago. Like, it's not like there is video evidence of what it looked like, it's not hard to find. And then the last thing I'll say on that is that I also think it's the fact that it's domestic. I think, we are so disconnected from those third world people over there. Like the people in power feel no pressure to apologize. But when it comes to like the people literally next door, it's a lot harder to look away. So I think it's more likely, and an apology is also for the most part performative. So as the like token Jew in the group, I did say like,
you can't say token and Jew in the same sentence.
I can say whatever the fuck I want. I am a Jew.
I'm just kidding.
No, I know.
I have Jewish heritage as well. I was making
Jesse has Jewish heritage too.
Yeah, I was making a joke.
Yeah, no, me too.
Okay.
But so I was just saying like, I have no right to say this, just as this is me in this group, but like, why do we need them to apologize? We know they're not really sorry. We know that it's performative, but like, that's what they want. So like, I need to shut up. Like, it doesn't matter. Like, if it helps, that's good. Like,
I think that an apology, as performative as it would be, and this is just like me thinking of it now, but I think all it really does is perhaps start a conversation and change a bit of the public perception, which is important. You need to get, public perception on your side in order to achieve any mission that you're going to accomplish. So you're right. It would be performative. Yeah. If it came from Joe Biden, I would laugh my ass off.
Exactly. Like you were a segregationist.
Yeah.
So,
yes.
But even though I don't believe you, the fact that you said it is now in the history books. You acknowledge like you as the white European or whatever is responsible for this. That's good.
Yeah, I agree with
Yeah.
that. I think it's, it definitely, especially getting it in the history books and just not even the apology, the acknowledgement, I think. Just for me, I think just say it out loud. Like, can somebody just acknowledge what we did, please? Like, can we just say that this was a terrible, horrible thing that we did? And, say you're sorry if you want. I'm not going to believe you anyway, but let's just acknowledge the atrocity,
Yeah.
you can't change what you don't acknowledge.
Oh,
So, that's really the first step.
And
Yep.
I think to the point of financial reparations, I agree with that. And again, I think it would be up to uh, those communities to decide, what that would entail.
What that means.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it
Because
reminds
it makes
me,
my head hurt.
yeah,
It's so
it
hard.
reminds me of this line, because awkward, I'm a big hip hop head. So I don't know if you're familiar with Billy Woods, the
Mhm.
rapper,
Mhm.
but he has a line in one of his recent songs. I mean, recent, but he's always putting stuff out that's really good. But um, he's got a line that's "Shorty can't eat no book." That's what I told Ta-Nehisi Coates, and it's sort of like this idea that I think what he's getting is that, like, yeah, the words, the apology is important, but like I lived in Bed-Stuy for several years, and that was like really where I saw, like, people want money, but not money because they want to be rich, because they just want to live comfortable
They want to
lives.
survive.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and I think that's what he was getting at, and I think that's why the financial aspect of reparations is so important,
Oh
because
yeah.
you know it's I had
Yeah. I mean,
it
it's
was actually
one
the
thing.
friendliest neighborhood I lived in, but I could see these people, and I don't mean these people like many different, but I could see the people in the neighborhood I was living in. At least every day it was a struggle, whether it was trying to find work, whether it was dealing with bullshit at work. The cops I lived on Chauncey Street. The cops were just, I mean, I even got marked because I was on the stoop with two of my friends who happened to be black, and these UCs drove by and went like that to all three of us. And, but I was able to move out. I had to, because I was broke, but um, they have to live with that every day. They have to deal with that every single day.
Yeah.
And I think it's true that if you empower people economically, and it doesn't have to be through a capitalist system, but when you empower people economically, things will improve, and they will have more.
Yeah.
Uh, I don't want to say sovereignty, because I feel like that's too. There's still going to be oppression. Like, again, this
Yeah.
idea that it's going to suddenly change overnight is a fallacy. But
Yeah.
but yeah, they just, I hate saying like putting them in a
I know,
different
but
group, but you know what I'm saying, hopefully. The people who live in those neighborhoods, they just want to live comfortable lives, and they want economic empowerment to decide for themselves how their lives turn
well, the
out. And
economic inequality that is very clear and distinct between white people and black people, or white people and indigenous people, that's not made up. That's a real thing, and it's something that needs to be rectified.
Right.
Forget about the atrocity of slavery, that they have been under economic oppression for hundreds of years, and we can only change that by, in my opinion, by some form of reparations. Again, I don't know what that looks like. I'm nowhere near smart enough to even begin to understand what that would look like. That's why I wanted to talk to people, because the whole point of us doing the show is so that we can talk to people smarter than us about things that we care about. And so
Yeah.
that's really where it comes from. It's like this, just curiosity of like trying to figure out what that means. But
Well,
yeah, I know. Oh, go ahead.
I was saying, I'm certainly not any smarter, but I think reparations addresses what was taken, and the that these communities being forced to start not on an even playing field, but so much more has to happen in addition to reparations to address the fact that, they continue to be disadvantaged, and, through education, in real estate, in healthcare, needless to say, in policing, and prosecution. So that's why reparations is a part of a collection of, significant changes that need to be made. And it's interesting, you mentioned Bed-Stuy because I also lived there, and I lived there right before the gentrification began. Slowly but surely, every neighborhood in New York City, now, Brooklyn, and now we're on to Queens, is being gentrified. When I first moved there, it was what it was. It was like a corner store on my corner, a bodega, and by the time I left, it was a sushi restaurant. And
which street did you live on, by the way?
It's bizarrely enough, like I have to look it up. I think it was Franklin Avenue. Is there a Franklin Avenue?
Yeah.
Okay, because for some weird reason, my time there and my time in Poughkeepsie, New York, I in my brain have meshed, and the street names and stuff I forget. I lived in the East Village for a really long time, and I'm more familiar with the Lower East Side, but for years I lived in Bed-Stuy, and it was interesting to hear, your experience, because I would literally be smoking a blunt or a spliff or whatever on my front porch on this main avenue. It's the biggest street that goes through this neighborhood, and the cops would screech up in unmarked vans and clear the entire street and leave me sitting there breaking the law.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I've told that story before because I think in my own experience, at least, nothing exemplifies the racial element better than that.
Yeah. And I have a similar anecdote that I think complements what you're saying. I was at my corner bodega when I lived in Bed-Stuy, and a drive-by shooting happened right down the street as I was walking into the door. And I almost want to say within less than a minute, that small section of the street where the shooting happened was swarming with every kind of cop you could think of, from detective to just a beat patrol cop, just a flat foot, as they say. And it was in an all, mostly all Black and brown community. And had that happened in Williamsburg, for example, I don't think the response would be the same. It was literally, I was shocked by how many police there were instantly there. I think they even beat the EMS there, if I'm not mistaken. But
you can go either way. In some of the more, in some of what they consider to be the more dangerous or tougher neighborhoods, there are places in this country, whether it's Chicago or New Orleans or even parts of New York, where historically cops have been afraid to go at all. But then when they do go, at the times or in the places they do go, it is so over the top, with the excessive stopping and frisking and all of that stuff. But when I think, if there was a drive-by shooting in Williamsburg, I think the response would have been very different. I don't think there'd be fewer cops. I think all of the rich white kids would have run, and there'd be a lot more screaming, and and the cops would have been much more nervous about the media coming because it was in this neighborhood. I was at, because you mentioned hip hop, I was at Sean Price's house in Brownsville, and there was a shooting right outside his building, and he kind of barely moved. He was so used to it, and no cops came.
Yeah.
So that's the other kind of way of the other type of thing that happens is it's so common. like in East New York, for instance, like didn't phase him, and like it didn't phase anyone else either. And the cops had no interest in solving it because it's like black on black crime. That's good for them.
Right. Yeah, that's so
Yeah.
true about the regularity of hearing gunshots. I can't say I've heard them as much in my lifetime as Sean probably has, but it got to the point where, yeah, we would hear, I was living with my ex-girlfriend at the time, but we would hear multiple volleys, if you will, throughout a single night. And rarely would you hear a siren or any kind of police activity in response. So I think, again, that
Yeah, it's definitely a
illustrates
tale of
what we're
two
talking
worlds
about.
for sure. I mean,
Mhm.
I've always lived in like little suburban, white America, and it's a completely different environment. It's, I mean,
And if there's a mass shooting in that place, they're gonna, take the guy
oh,
out, very gently and take him to Burger King, and
yeah,
you know,
he'll get a pat on the head and it's okay. And don't you worry. Yeah, it's,
and then everyone's gonna say that we're crisis actors too, and that no one actually died.
Yeah.
What a crazy
Well,
place we.
oh,
I
yeah,
try
it
to
is.
like the conspiracies on the left are as crazy as the conspiracies on the right, and I do try to avoid them. Like
mhm.
this stuff that's been going on with like cozying up to Nazis and cheering on the people who stormed the Capitol just doesn't hit me. Having family members like survived the Holocaust to enable me to exist. Like it bothers me.
Mhm.
See, now I have a question for you about that, and it may be a little controversial and whatever, but do you really think that every single person there is a Nazi?
Well, since there were clearly journalists who were on the left and just covering it, I can easily answer that question and say no.
Right, because I had friends there, and they said that not everybody, most people were there. Most of the people, like there was the idiots, and I don't know what affiliation they have or who they were with or whatever, but I think most people were just there because they felt like the election was stolen from them for whatever reason.
That's enough.
I mean,
That's enough for me. Like I
what?
went and I protested George W. Bush's inauguration. I think I protested the one before that. Like I know that one of them is when like the FBI got their file on me because they like took my mask off and like had me contained, and like there were sharpshooters. Like I've been through all that, and I would have protested Biden's election if I wasn't afraid of all the Nazis who were doing the same thing, and I now didn't have two kids I had to protect.
Right.
But if as far as I'm concerned, if you voted for Trump, who's a white supremacist, and you believe that the election was stolen from him and are going to protest to reinstate someone who has never won the popular vote, you're not my ally. So whether I call them a Nazi is not actually that important. I mean, I, as a human being, am prone to exaggeration, to loudness, and like, sure, I'm sure some of them aren't full-on racist anti-Semites. To me, then, if you're on the side of racists and anti-Semites, you're ignorant, and like you in your current form are not my ally. Anyone who went there to participate in the storming of the Capitol because they're pro-Trump is not my friend. That doesn't mean, like I said way earlier, I cannot help you understand why we could be friends and should be friends, but right now we are not. And like,
So do you feel the same way about Biden voters, since he's also a racist and a segregationist, and that, he has that same sort of background?
great
Or is it
question.
different for you?
Great question. I have to say no, which is going to sound rightfully so hypocritical and like everything else you want to label it. The only reason being is that we were in a position that was so dangerous where we had someone on Twitter inciting violence across the country, telling white supremacist groups to attack anti-fascists and black people. This is the same, like, I mean, language is important especially when you're in a position of power, when you're ostensibly the most powerful person in the entire world, and you're calling Mexicans like rapists and whatever else he called them. And he's, labeling Nazis at Charlottesville, very fine people. We are in a major, major situation that in a million years, if I had a choice to not vote for Biden, believe me, I wouldn't have. As someone whose primary focus is racial and social justice and criminal justice, like voting for the guy who wrote the crime bill and his, the worst DA in like U.S. history possibly is his running mate, the guy who was a segregationist when like my family members were protesting, as members of Students for a Democratic Society, it tortured me. But I could not risk having Trump win, and I can't risk in the future having a prettier, smarter, more savvy fascist replace him as the new representative of this country when Biden probably loses next election. Like, we have to move in a positive direction, and as horrible as Biden is for people in this country and for people outside of this country, I was put in a really bad position. Like, as a Jew, there was no way I was not making sure that Trump didn't win, and he almost did, right? Like, for the second time, half this country thought that psychopath, that rapist, that criminal should be president. And the fact that I hold everyone accountable. Like, I hold the Democratic Party, fuck the DNC. I hold the Democratic Party accountable for giving us one other option who's also a rapist and a racist.
And a war criminal.
Right,
Yeah.
and war criminal. I was nauseous voting for him, but I felt like I had no other choice.
So
unless you want me to say I hate myself, I guess I can't hate everyone else who
No,
voted.
I'm honestly just curious your viewpoint on it, because
Really
we've been talking, like I've been talking to this, to people on Twitter. I mean, I live in small town Ohio, so I'm surrounded by Trump voters. And, for me, they're not all terrible people. Are some of them casually racist and, assholes? Sure. Are some of them like extremely racist? Absolutely. But for the most part, I think that they're just average people who work hard, they're getting screwed, and they've been propagandized to be mad at the wrong people and the wrong things.
Exactly.
And
why I say that they don't have to always be my enemy. Yeah. That anyone can be transformed.
I think, that's why I asked, because I think that's what's dangerous. There's a lot of people on the left right now labeling 75 million people as irredeemable racists. And I don't think that's fair.
That. Right.
Yeah, I don't think that's fair.
Right. I agree with you. And I'm not doing that. And for what it's worth, not a single one of these people, or even all of them collectively, are as dangerous as the systemic racism that goes on in this country. So the criminalization of race and poverty through all of these, mechanisms that are part and parcel of this system, this capitalist racist system, all of those things are way worse than any individual or group of individuals who might be racist, right? Like,
Absolutely.
What microaggressions on a daily basis may hurt your feelings, but they're not going to send your dad to prison and like have you frisked every time you go to school. Like, it's a totally different scenario.
And in some sense, they are also victims of those institutions. Right. I mean, they go to the public schools and they're taught white supremacist history, and they're taught imperialist history, and you know what I mean? It's all, I mean, I just try to look at things from more of an open point of view. Like, I agree with you. Obviously, I'm not ever aligning myself with a Proud Boy. Do I hope that some of those Proud Boys ditch that mentality and, join a more human mindset? Absolutely. But I mean, I have no desire to align with them. But like I said, I'm surrounded by Trump voters. My kids' best friends are Trump voters. The guy at my favorite gas station's a Trump voter. He always talks to me about college football, and I love him. And like, they're not bad people. Maybe would I hang out with them? Maybe not, but they're not terrible people. They really are just victims of, propaganda and just the institutions that we all find ourselves, under the control of. So, I just on the left, I think it's been very dangerous lately. When we talked about language, you talked about language and how important it is. Labeling 75 million people as literal Nazis is a bit much for me. I mean, that's a bit extreme, and I don't think that that's a fair assessment of them at all. I'm not trying to defend like Trump voters. People voted for Trump for a multitude of reasons. For example, being in Ohio, trade's a big issue here. People are not going to vote for, NAFTA. I mean, Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden, that's NAFTA for them. And that destroyed my state. So, I think that it's not everybody voted for Trump for racist reasons. Are they misguided in voting for him because he is a racist? Of course. But I just don't think it's fair to label them all as, lump them all together, label them as a monolith and say that they're irredeemable. So, yeah, I mean, I was just honestly just curious about your opinion, because it's been something that's been battered around on Twitter for the last couple of weeks. And, I just think that the language that's being used is very, it's not making it better. It's not helping. All it's doing is fueling the fire and the division. And, they would love nothing more for there to be a race war, because then there's not a class war,
Who's they?
Yeah, we gotta focus on the real enemies.
The Trump supporters, you mean?
Yeah. Who do
No,
you mean when you say they?
I think the establishment.
Oh, okay.
They don't want us focused on them. If it's a class war, then we're fighting them.
Right. And I agree with you, but I think part of the problem, I have two thoughts on what you said, and I think everything you said is very fair. I think that my problem is that, the true leftists want justice and access to equal access to like healthcare and shelter and food and all of these things. We want to fight the class war. Too much of the right, if not a vast majority of the right, wants currently, in their current state and mindset, wants to fight a race war. So as long as they are in that mindset, I need to be wary of them.
Oh, for sure.
But I think the change in my language may be noteworthy to you. I'm one person, but it's, I think, possibly indicative of one thing that might be happening. Is when it first happened, I was labeling them things like Capitol rioters, and I think that was my most common choice. And as I saw more and more people on the left platforming and talking about aligning with fascists, members of groups that are known fascist groups, while dissing any leftist who was not radical enough for them and calling them sellouts and whatever, my language got more and more aggressive in the opposite direction. And it wasn't intentional. I didn't think of it until you just said this, but I'm now calling them Nazis, and I didn't start that way. So I don't know what came first. I kind of think that like I am now, my natural reaction as a human, not being 100% strategic all of the time, like I'd rather go over the top and push myself further away from literal Nazis and those who are willing to collaborate with them, than there be any ambiguity or any gray area with, possibly connecting me as with that, because so in essence, like I'm not in full control over it even. Like what I'm doing is a response to what I'm seeing that freaked me out, pissed me off, and everything else.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think it's your fear is legitimate, and again, you have 2 kids, you have a wife, you have a family, and
right. Dominican Jews, like that's not safe.
Say again.
Dominican Jews, that's not safe.
Yeah, but speaking to Misty's point, or building off of that, there definitely were neo-Nazis present in that crowd. We've seen the pictures of the flags, and my approach has been to not align myself with them, but try as much as I can to look at it and ask why. Like, why did this happen? The question you weren't allowed to ask after right after 9/11 happened. Like, why would people do this to other people? And I'm still trying to figure that out on a daily basis. And I do believe one can do that without aligning oneself, with these particular individuals. And,
Totally.
but I think,
yeah, I think having a conversation with somebody is much different than aligning. I'm always like,
but I get where you're coming from, Awkward. I get it that,
yeah,
because I feel I've been pilloried for advocating just the hashtag ACAB, which I actually believe, because I think policing is an inherently corrupt system, just like the US government is. And you enter it, you're going to get subsumed and corrupted by the system. Like, you're not going to change it. You're not going to reform it. That's just a pipe dream. But so I think, and I wouldn't even call it inflammatory language. I think it's, maybe not at least in my, from my perspective, for, the ACAB, what the hell is that called? When it's, what the hell is the word for that? When it's
acronym,
yeah.
Oh.
Sorry.
Too
many A's and C's at once. But it is, I think there is a need to be provocative with language, not gratuitously so, but to, this is a cliche, but wake people up in a sense, to shake people up. There is a need for that, I believe. And I think the best journalists work with language that way too. And they often get labeled as, putting their opinion in or editorializing too much. But
I don't have any problem with that,
I don't either. And
I don't either.
As long as you're honest that that's what you're doing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I think that you're not just bandying the term about, from what you've explained, you're using it in, you said, you're not always strategic, but I think you are using it in a strategic way to kind of, you're angry, you're scared, and it's a way to react. And I think there is a certain amount of legitimacy to it. So, and again, like, this is all complex. We're complex individuals. Yeah. We don't have the perfect answers. We're all going to have different responses, even on the left. Like, I consider you a comrade. And I don't even like to say on the left anymore. I just like to say anti-imperialist, because I feel like that covers being an anti-racist, that covers being an abolitionist.
It doesn't cover being anti-capitalist necessarily, though, which is the only thing I have a problem with when you say anti-imperialist. Really? But yeah.
Why do you say that? I'm
curious.
I
would have thought it did.
It kind of does, because our economic system is based around the military-industrial complex and imperialism, but it doesn't necessarily, like, to me, it doesn't scream like capitalism is over. You know what I'm saying? Like, you can still have a capitalist system and not have imperialism. Lots of countries do it. So,
right.
It's interesting. Like, again, it's like the complexity of words, because my initial thought was, anti-imperialism is definitely anti-capitalism, but I'm not sure it's anti-racist. So, I guess everything's up for debate.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think a good thing to read, it's short but very informative, is Orwell's essay on what is fascism, and he breaks it down.
I haven't read that.
It's very, if you just
you can Google it. It's free online.
Yeah, Orwell and fascism. It's easy to find.
DuckDuckGo.
Yeah, that's what I use. But he breaks it down and shows that, like, yes, fascism exists, and there are many iterations of it. There's the what we saw in the former Soviet bloc countries, for example. There's what we saw in Spain under Franco. So the problem is that people use it now, especially without any kind of thought behind it, without any kind of strategy to why they're using the word. And I don't think it's unfair for them, or that they shouldn't use the word, but I think, like what you've been doing, there should be some calculus behind it. And again, words have power, words affect behavior. So I think, these are, the conversation we're having, and these ideas are things we need to we need to keep just not only discussing, but, putting into action in the best ways we can figure out.
Yeah. And I mean, yeah, like, and I totally, in truth, I'm pretty calculated, like I do think about what I'm saying, and,
Yeah.
but again, like, we're all human. I totally,
Yeah.
like, when it comes to like my public persona, my presentation of ideas and things like that, and like a public format, I'm a lot more controlled because I'm a human. When it comes to like interpersonal stuff, like I'm much more apt to like do it wrong, because
Right.
I've learned somehow to be careful and more thoughtful in this way when I'm like emotionally in this immediate situation with my kid or something. Like, I can't handle it as well.
Right.
But
Yeah. I relate
Yeah.
to that so hard.
Yeah.
So you've been very generous with your time. I don't want to keep you any longer.
Yeah.
Can you just tell everybody where they can find 10 Demands for Justice, your
Sure,
Twitter, if you have any new music coming out, all of that stuff? Hit us with it.
This was fun. I mean, I think this is
Yeah.
the longest interview I've done. I did have
Sorry, we get that a
no.
lot.
I mean, like, really? I mean, like,
Yeah.
the time flew. Like, I have another meeting in 15 minutes, so I was keeping an eye on it, but I was like, all right, whatever, hour and 45, that's cool.
Wow, it's been that long already?
Yeah.
Yes, we get that a lot. This is the longest interview I've ever done. I'm sorry.
No, it was totally good. I enjoyed it.
Good.
I just
Awesome.
hope people watch it. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So anyway, it's 10forjustice.com. It's spelled out TENFOR justice.com. That's where the demands are and everything else. The Twitter for the group is 10 Demands. My Twitter is Awkward Rap, awkward spelled with an O. And my website is thisisawkward.com. I did release the 10 Demands song and video not that long ago, which I think is my best work yet when it comes to songwriting, like the song itself. And I got an amazing chorus from Jesse Jett, who also made the beat. And once we made that song together, we decided we're going to work on an EP. So
Nice.
I haven't like put out an album in almost 7 years now, but I'll be doing so in 2021, working with Jesse, doing all of the music and some of the choruses. And, I'll be broaching a variety of subjects that will, be of interest to your audience for sure.
Excellent.
Yeah,
We'll definitely keep an
looking
eye out for
forward to
that. And
that.
we'll link to all the website and stuff. We'll link to all that stuff in the show notes so people can find it as
Cool.
easily as possible. So yeah, everybody, our guest today has been Awkward. It has been an amazing conversation. And thanks for joining us. We'll catch you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you.